Hello guys, welcome to your own channel Chess Radio Kolkata. Now you are showing the Mikhail saga. The game was played in 1/4/1949 in Vilnius versus Mikhail from Latvia, playing with the white pieces and Vendrov with the black pieces, the Sicilian defense. Yes, Mikhail started with the e4 and black replies with c5. The Sicilian defense after knight f3 and e6, that is the Sicilian defense French variation. Now after d4 and c captures d4 and knight captures d4, black plays knight f6, so the game was converted into the open Sicilian. Now knight c3 and bishop d4, e5, knight d5, bishop d2, now bishop into c3. Now here you can see also the alternative like knight into c3, so bishop into b into c3 could be followed, and white is in a slight advantage. But at the game after this position, white plays b into c3. Now after queen c5, but let me show you one thing, that after bishop into c3, short castle could be done. So that is a game from 1982 in Berlin. Vot versus Ermenkov. So the game followed like bishop d3, d6, queen h5, or you can see the alternative like e into d6. Now queen into d6 and short castle, and white is gaining the full advantage. Although you can see after e into d6, queen into d6, the g6 could be followed. Now after queen e2 and d into e5, queen into e5, knight d7, queen d6, queen f6, short castle, b6, knight c6, knight c5, c4, e5, queen into e5. Okay, now let's back to our game. Like after b into c3, black plays queen c7, so Mikhail plays f4. Wow, what a move, attacking the central pawn, supporting with open up the square for the rook. But it is too early because this is the Mikhail game. So black plays a6 and queen f3, knight c6, so knight into c6, d into c6. Yes, that's the game. You can see fireworks all over the places. Now c4, knight e7, bishop d3, or you can see the alternative like c5, now short castle and bishop d3 with the initiative. Although you can see after c5, here you can see black can play knight d5, and here you can see just the castle. Okay, so just back to a little bit earlier. After bishop d3 in the game, opponent played c5. Now queen g3, g6, short castle, bishop d7, bishop e4, bishop c6, bishop f3, long castle, bishop c3, knight f5. Now you can see black has a slight advantage. But after queen f2, or also you can see like queen e1 with the idea of bishop a5 could be followed. So back to the game. After knight f5 and queen f2, black plays knight d4, and white replies with rook a to d1. But according to the engine, bishop d1 was better. After the following like rook d7 and rook c1 with the idea of bishop e2 and followed by d3. But let's see at the game. After bishop d1, after rook a to d1, that is bishop captures f3, g captures f3, knight f5, rook b1, rook d7, queen e2, rook h to d8, rook b2, knight d4, queen f2, queen c6, or you can see the alternative like g5, bishop into d4, although you can see queen into e3, or g into f4, queen into f4, knight into check, although you can see at this position f into g5. Now after queen into e5, bishop into d4, queen into g5, check, or at this position you can also followed by rook into d4, and after f into g5 and queen into e5, f4 and queen c7, with the idea of rook c4 by black. Now at the game, after queen f2, black plays queen c6. So Mikhail tiled his blind with bishop a5, and after rook e8, c3, queen a4, c into d4, bishop, queen into a5. Although you can see the alternative like bishop b6, and after knight f5, queen into c5 check, king b8, with the idea of rook c8. But let's back to the game. After queen a4, it's c into d4 and queen into a5 and d into c5. Now although you can capture with the rook d1, but at the game it's d into c5, and after rook e to d8, the better could be rook c7 followed by rook f2 b1 and rook e to e7. Okay, but although in the game after d into c5 is rook e to d8 and rook f to b1. Now here also you can see c6. Now rook d2, now rook into d2, queen into d2, c into b7 check, king into b7, rook b1 check, king a8. Now you can see king is on the corner. Now from c6, that is the second variation, you can see, that is b into c6, rook f to b1, rook d1 check, rook into d1, rook into d1 check, king g2, rook d7. Okay, although the last variation I like to show you, that is after this position, you can see like a kind of any scenario like this, it could be easily met by this sort of situation. Now it's really doesn't matter that how you capture this pawn, you need to bring out your queen for capturing this pawn. But although let's back to the game, like after rook f to b1, that is rook d2 and queen e3, rook 8 to d3, now queen e4, queen into c5 check, king h1, rook d1 check, rook into d1, rook into d1 check, king g2, queen g1 check. Now also you can see the alternative like rook d7. Now you can see black is in a slight advantage. But let's back to the game. After queen g2, that is king g2, sorry, king g2, that is queen g1 check, and after king h3, that is queen f1 check. This is not a necessary check, but black is giving the check. But although you can see rook d7 should be considerable, the game should be followed like c5 and queen d4. Guys, you can think about this from the position. But after queen h3, that is queen f1 check, unnecessary check, and after king h4, that is queen e1 check, and after queen into e1, rook into e1, king g5. Now you can see white is a slight advantage. Now rook d1. Now king f6, rook d7, rook b6, rook c7, rook b2. Now here you can see c5 is the better move, but although in the game rook b2. Now opponent plays rook into c4 and Tal replied with queen into f3. Now you can see rook into f4 check, king into e6, rook into f3, rook d2, b5, queen e7, b4, e6, a5, queen e8, a4, rook d4. Now you can see the position is a little bit better for white. Now b3, rook c4 check, king b7, rook into a4, b into a2, rook into a2, g5, rook c2, g4, rook c5, rook h3, rook g5, rook into h2, rook into g4, rook f2, rook h4, rook f6, rook into h7 check, king c8, e7, rook f1, rook f7, rook h1, king f8, rook h8 check, king g7, rook e8, rook f8, king d7, rook into 8, king into e8, and after king f7 opponent resigned the game. So it's a good victory for Mikhail Tal. Okay, let's watch the game once again. Is e4, c5, Sicilian defense, knight f3, e6, d4, c into d4, knight into d4, knight f6, knight c3, bishop b4, e5, knight d5, bishop e2, bishop into c3, b into c3, queen c7, f4, s6, queen f3, knight c6, knight into c6, d into c6, c4, knight e2, bishop d3, c5, queen g3, g6, short castle. Now bishop d7, bishop e4, bishop e6, bishop f3, long castle, bishop e3, knight f5, queen f2, knight d4, rook a to d1, bishop into f3, g into f3, knight f5, rook b1, rook d7, queen e2, rook h to d8, rook b2, knight d4, queen f2, queen c6, bishop a5, rook e8, c3, queen a4, c into d4, queen into a5, d into c5, rook e to d8, rook f to b1, rook d2, queen e3, rook 8 to d3, queen e4, queen c5 check, king h1, rook d1 check, rook into d1, rook into d1 check, king g2, queen g1 check, king h3, queen f1 check, king h4, queen e1 check, queen into e1, rook into e1, queen g5, rook d1, king f6, rook d7, rook b6, rook c7, rook b2, rook into c4, king into f7, rook into f4 check, king into e6, rook into f3, rook d2, king e7, b4, e6, a5, king e8, a4, rook d4, b3, rook c4 check, king b7, rook into a4, b into a2, rook into a2, g5, rook c2, g4, rook c5, rook h3, rook g5, rook into h2, rook into g4, rook f2, rook h4, rook f6, rook into h7 check, king c8, e7, rook f1, rook f7, rook h1, king f8, rook h8 check, king g7, rook e8. Now rook f8 and king d7. Now rook captures e8 and king captures e8. Now after king f7, opponent resign. So thanks for watching the game. I hope you learned from the opening that how to crush the Sicilian defense and also the end game. So thanks for watching. I hope we will meet you soon. And tribute to the Mikhail Tal. Now he is only 12 or 13 years old. So thanks for watching and love you. Bye.